Göbekli Tepe itself was the end of a process, not the beginning of a process. It was something that marked, it was a marker. It was something that brought together the best of everything that they'd accumulated and created it in one place.
Well, the sight of Göbekli Tepe really did send shockwaves through the whole world of early prehistory, because we'd never before known or imagined even.
For 12,000 years, we believed Göbekli Tepe in Turkey was humanity's first great temple, a sacred place of faith built from stone. But that beautiful story just shattered. Deep beneath the foundations, archaeologists have breached a sealed cave that was never a tomb, but a prison. Its entrance is a brutal wall of rock and razor-sharp obsidian shards, all positioned to stop something from ever getting out. Above this prison, the ground itself is mysteriously scorched, scarred by an impossible heat. Why is the cradle of civilization built directly on top of a maximum security containment cell? What were our ancestors so terrified of that they had to cage it in stone? And what unspeakable event forced them to try and burn its very existence from the face of the earth? The anomaly in the Earth's layers in the country of Turkey. High on a dry hill, there is an ancient place called Göbekli Tepe. For many years, scientists have studied its huge stone pillars, which are shaped like the letter T, and they have looked closely at the beautiful pictures of animals carved into the stone. Based on all this evidence, almost everyone agreed on one simple story: that Göbekli Tepe was the world's first temple, a special gathering place where ancient hunter-gatherers, people who hunted animals and collected plants for food, came together for religious ceremonies more than 12,000 years ago. This was the accepted truth, a peaceful story about the dawn of human belief and community. But a different group of scientists, a team made of geologists who study rocks and archaeologists who study ancient human life, were not looking at the famous pillars on the surface. Instead, they were interested in something much deeper. A small detail that other teams had seen but never fully investigated. Deep in the ground, far below the foundation of one of the oldest stone circles, they found a strange and very thin layer of dark-colored soil. When they took samples of this dark soil back to their laboratory, they discovered something that should not have been there. The soil contained a very high amount of a rare metal called iridium. And iridium is an element that is not common on Earth, but is found in asteroids and comets from outer space. They also found thousands of tiny glass balls, almost like microscopic beads, which are created when rock is heated up so fast and to such a high temperature that it melts into liquid and then cools instantly into glass. Together, these two clues, the iridium and the glass spheres, almost always point to one of two things: either a massive asteroid hitting the Earth from space, or an incredibly powerful explosion that created extreme heat. But here is where the story became deeply strange. If an asteroid had hit, this layer of dark soil and metal would be spread out over a very large area, covering many miles in every direction, like a blanket of dust from the disaster. However, this strange layer was not spread out at all. It was found only in one specific, concentrated spot, right around the area beneath that single stone circle. This evidence did not look like a natural accident. It looked like a targeted event, which forced the scientists to ask a disturbing new question. Why does it seem like a powerful, localized heat explosion happened right here, directly underneath the foundations of the world's oldest sacred site? This mark in the earth was not a random scar left by nature. It felt more like the deliberate blast mark left behind by some kind of ancient weapon. And it was located directly above the very thing they were about to break open. The entrance not made for the living. Because the team of scientists found that strange, blast, marked layer in the soil, they knew that they had to start digging deeper in that exact spot, carefully removing the earth to see what was hidden underneath. After much work, Their shovels hit something hard, but it was not the natural bedrock they expected to find. Instead, they uncovered the top of a massive wall made of huge, rough stones, each one very large and heavy. This wall was not built with the same skill or beauty as the T-shaped pillars on the surface above. It was constructed in a crude and simple way, but it was incredibly strong and thick, as if its only purpose was to be powerful and impossible to break. It was clear that this wall was man-made, and it was deliberately blocking the natural entrance to a dark cave that went deeper into the hill. As they cleared away more dirt, they discovered the most shocking and disturbing detail of all. In the gaps and spaces between the giant stones of the wall, ancient people had jammed hundreds of sharp pieces of black, volcanic glass called obsidian. Obsidian can be broken to create an edge that is sharper than any modern knife or razor blade, and it was often used to make ancient weapons and tools. But the way these obsidian shards were placed in the wall was completely wrong and backwards, according to any normal logic. A normal defensive wall would have the sharp points facing outwards, to stop enemies from climbing or breaking in. But here, every single piece of sharp obsidian was pointing inwards, facing away from the builders and into the darkness of the cave. When experts who study evidence, known as forensic analysis, examined the placement of the shards, they concluded that this design could only have one purpose. The wall was not built to keep people out of the cave. It was built to stop something that was already inside the cave from ever getting out. And the razor, sharp glass, was meant to cut and injure anything that tried to force its way through from the inside. At that moment, the entire idea of a sacred temple or a hidden tomb was gone, replaced by a much more terrifying reality. This was not a door to a secret place. It was the wall of a prison. And the people who built it did not just want to lock the door. They wanted to punish whatever was trapped on the other side. The silent echoes on the stone. The team of scientists knew that opening the wall was extremely dangerous, because the razor, sharp obsidian shards, were a clear warning from the ancient world, so they worked very slowly and with great care, removing the giant stones one by one, making sure that the entire structure did not collapse. After many hours, they finally created a small and safe opening, a dark doorway leading into the hill. The first thing they noticed when they looked inside was the air. It was heavy and thick and had a strange, stale smell, as if nothing had breathed it for thousands of years. They had to wear special breathing equipment to enter safely. Once they were inside the cave, their powerful lights cut through a darkness that had been absolute and unbroken since the stone wall was first built. The first thing the archaeologists did was search for artifacts, which are the objects that ancient people leave behind, like broken pottery, old tools, or the remains of a fireplace. But they found nothing at all. The floor of the cave was covered only in a thick layer of fine dust, and the walls were completely bare. This was extremely unusual, because even people staying in a cave for a short time will leave behind some kind of trash or evidence, like bones from an animal they ate or charcoal from a fire they used to stay warm. An area with absolutely no signs of human life is called a sterile environment by archaeologists, and finding one inside a sealed, man-made structure was deeply confusing. It suggested that no human had ever lived in this space, or even used it for any kind of normal purpose. Then, as they moved their lights across the walls of the cave, they saw something that made them all stop. The limestone walls were not smooth, from the floor to the ceiling. The stone was covered in thousands of deep scratches, long lines that had been carved violently into the rock. These were not the careful marks made by human tools. When ancient people carved stone, they left behind specific patterns, small and controlled cuts from a stone chisel or a flint knife. These marks were completely different. They were long, parallel grooves, as if a creature with multiple sharp points on its hands had dragged its claws down the rock again and again in a display of incredible anger and desperation. When the science team analyzed the shape and depth of these scratches, they confirmed that they could not have been made by any known human tool from that time. They were claw marks, scattered across the floor in the dust. They found more evidence. There were broken pieces of animal bones, perhaps from animals that were thrown into the cave as food. But these bones were not simply cracked open to get the marrow. They were completely shattered into tiny fragments. The forensic experts on the team explained that the amount of force needed to crush bone, this completely, was enormous, far greater than the bite force of any known predator, like a wolf or a bear, that lived in that region during that time. The evidence was now pointing to a single, terrifying conclusion. The thing that was imprisoned in this cave was not human. It was an incredibly strong and aggressive creature, a predator that had been locked away in the darkness. And the marks on the walls were not art or symbols. They were the silent echoes of its rage, a permanent record of the terrible thing the ancient people had fought so hard to contain. The scene of the final battle, lifting the enormous, perfectly fitted granite stone from the bottom of the deep shaft, was the most difficult challenge the science team had faced so far. It was so heavy and so precisely placed that modern cranes and lifting equipment had to be brought to the ancient site. And the entire process was slow and dangerous, taking several weeks to complete. Everyone understood that whatever this giant stone was sealing away, the ancient builders had used all of their power and knowledge to make sure it was permanent. When the granite plug was finally raised and moved to the side, it revealed a dark, hollow space underneath, a completely sealed chamber that had been cut off from the world for 12,000 years. The team set up powerful lights, pointing them down into the darkness, and prepared to finally see what the ancient people had tried so hard to hide. What they saw at the bottom of the chamber made the entire team fall silent. At first, it looked like a collection of skeletons, and their first thought was that this was a burial chamber. But as they looked closer, they realized something was terribly wrong. There were 3 skeletons that were immediately identifiable as being not human. The shape of their bones was completely different from a normal person. Their chests were much wider and more heavily built. Their bones were thicker and denser, and their skulls had the powerful jaws and teeth of a predator, not a human. These were the remains of the very same creatures that had left the deep claw marks on the walls of the cave above. But they were not alone. Mixed in with the remains of these strange creatures, in a chaotic and messy pile, were the skeletons of several normal humans, Homo sapiens, just like us. This was not a respectful burial of the dead. It was a scene of utter violence. The skeletons were not laid out peacefully. They were tangled together in unnatural positions, with broken arms and legs twisted around each other as if they had fallen in a terrible struggle. Forensic experts, the scientists who study evidence of death and injury, were brought in to examine the bones, and what they found confirmed the team's worst fears. This was not a grave. It was a battlefield. Both the human skeletons and the skeletons of the strange creatures showed evidence of horrific injuries. A human skull had been crushed by a powerful blow. The arm bones of one of the creatures had been broken. There were deep cut marks on the ribs of both humans and the creatures, evidence that they had been stabbed with sharp weapons. This was the undeniable proof of a desperate, final battle that had happened right here. In this small chamber deep underground, the ancient people had not just imprisoned these creatures, they had fought them. And this chamber was the place where that long-forgotten war had finally come to an end. The legacy of the gatekeepers. With the discovery of the final, violent battle at the bottom of the chamber, the entire history of Göbekli Tepe suddenly became clear, and the full, terrifying story could finally be told. The scientists now understood that this famous ancient site was not just a temple built for worship. The reason the ancient people chose this specific hill was because it was the location of this terrible conflict. The temple was constructed directly on top of the battlefield, not just as a monument to remember the dead, but as a powerful seal and a permanent warning to all future generations. Every strange clue they had found, from the deepest layer of earth to the tallest stone pillar, was a piece of this one. Horrifying story. The big question. What terrible thing had our ancestors faced? Now had a complete answer. They had faced a war for the survival of the human race against another intelligent, predatory species. The team could now explain everything. The strange, blast, marked layer of dark soil deep in the ground was no longer a mystery. It was likely the evidence of the final weapon used in the war, a terrible event of extreme heat, perhaps from a fire so large and intense that it melted the very rock, used by the ancient humans to end the conflict and cleanse the site. The crude wall with the sharp obsidian shards was the first, desperate barrier they built. It was an emergency measure, put up quickly after the battle to make sure that if any of the creatures had survived, they would be trapped inside. It was a prison wall built in a time of fear and chaos. Then, after the immediate danger was over, the ancient people returned with a plan. They used all their strength and knowledge to create the deep, vertical shaft and seal it with the impossibly heavy granite plug. This was the permanent solution, an incredible piece of ancient engineering designed to lock this dark history away forever. A final guarantee that the enemy would never rise again. This new knowledge gave a new and terrible meaning to the famous temple on the surface. The great stone pillars, with their animal carvings, were not just a place to worship gods. Instead, they may have been silent stone guardians, a permanent set of watchmen built to stand over the prison below for all time. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not just priests and worshippers. They were the gatekeepers. They were the survivors of a forgotten war. And they spent their lives making sure that the gate to the underworld they had sealed would never be opened. Their greatest achievement, the building of the world's first temple, was not motivated by faith in the gods. It was motivated by a deep and lasting fear of the things that crawled out of the earth. The question was no longer what they fought, but what was the price of their victory? And as the scientists stood there, looking at the evidence of this ancient war, they had to wonder, are there other gates like this one, hidden beneath other ancient sites around the world, still waiting to be found? We are not alone. We are just the last ones left. This discovery at Göbekli Tepe is not just another interesting fact for the history books. Instead, it is something that changes the entire story of what it means to be a human being. The old, peaceful idea that our ancient ancestors were simple people who slowly came together to worship the gods and build temples is completely wrong. The truth is much darker and more violent. The very beginning of human civilization, the moment we started building things that were bigger than ourselves, was not born from hope or faith. It was born from the terror and the trauma of a terrible war for survival. Human history is not a story about our rise to intelligence. It is the story of our victory as the most dangerous species on the planet. This new knowledge forces us to look at our oldest stories in a completely new way. Every ancient culture in the world has myths, which are very old stories passed down through many generations, that tell of epic battles against monsters, giants, demons, or strange gods. We have always thought these were just fantasy stories, created by our ancestors to explain things they did not understand, like thunderstorms or earthquakes. But now, we must consider a much more shocking possibility. What if these myths are not fantasies at all? What if they are the last? Faded memories of a real war? The stories of heroes fighting monsters might be the distant echo of the real human soldiers who fought and died in that chamber deep beneath Göbekli Tepe. Our collective memory as a species may have never forgotten this conflict. It just turned the real enemy into the monsters of our legends. This also explains why human society developed in the way that it did. The first great act of our civilization was not to build a temple. It was to build a prison. The need to organize, to plan, and to work together to defeat a powerful enemy may have been the very thing that forced us to become civilized in the first place. We learned how to build massive structures, not to please the gods, but because we needed to build a wall to keep the monsters out. Our ability to create complex societies, to form armies, and to control large areas of land was not developed for farming or for trade. It was developed as a weapon in a war for the control of the entire planet. We did not become civilized in spite of our violence. We became civilized because of our violence. And so, this discovery leaves us with a final, chilling thought that changes our place in the universe. For centuries, we have looked up at the stars and asked the same question. Are we all alone? The silence of the universe has always made us feel special, but also very lonely. But the story of Göbekli Tepe suggests a different and much more terrifying answer. Maybe the universe is not empty, and maybe, just maybe, our own planet was not empty either. The silence we hear today might not be because we are the only intelligent life to have ever existed. The silence might be here because 12,000 years ago, our ancestors fought a bloody war to make sure they were the only ones left. We are not alone in the universe. Perhaps we are just the last ones left standing.